guys, welcome back to PsychE-Learning. If you're interested in seeing what this channel is all about, feel free to go check out our other videos. But if not, no worries, we'll go ahead and get started with today's video. As you could probably guess from the title of today's video, I'm trying to keep up with the Halloween theme and do a more spooky themed video. So we're going to be going over some of the different horrifying, unethical psychological experiments that have taken place in history. Just to give you guys some background, there is a code of ethics that psychologists have to follow today, so none of these should be happening anymore. The APA, the American Psychological Association, came out with this ethical guideline back in the early 2000s just to make sure none of this stuff ever happens again, so you guys can go check that out. I have a link in the description. But the APA Code of Ethics followed some main guidelines that I'll go over with you today. The first main principle is beneficence and non-maleficence. So what this basically means is that when you operate or perform an experiment, that you have to have the goals be something that's supposed to benefit people, not something that harms or has the intent to harm others. And the second one is fidelity and responsibility. So this is there to make sure that the experimenters and the participants have trust between each other and that the experimenters are responsible and held accountable for what goes on with the participants. And then the next two are integrity and justice. And these are pretty self-explanatory, so I won't go into them. And then the last one is respect for people's rights and dignities. So that's just making sure that human rights and animal rights as well are not violated when performing experiments. So usually experimenters will create an informed consent form. I know it's kind of redundant with the terminology, but this is just to make sure that participants are going into experiments fully aware of what is going to happen and what is going on, so that way they are prepared to handle whatever is thrown at them, whether it's electroshock, which surprisingly does happen in some places today, or if it's some sort of psychological manipulation, they at least know what's going on. And even if you're in university and you're studying psychology, you've probably created one of these once or twice. I know I have. So it is used pretty often in psychology today, and you shouldn't perform an experiment without one. There are two psychologists who can be credited with creating the first psychology lab. The very first one was done by William James at Harvard in 1875, but as this was a teaching lab, it's not exactly the one that people usually refer to when they talk about the first lab. So the first experimental lab that people usually mention, it was done by Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig in 1879. So even though it was a couple years later, it still is usually credited as the first one just because of its importance and the fact that it was experimental rather than teaching. And this really took psychology from being kind of a subsect of philosophy and biology into its own psychological, scientific entity, which is very exciting stuff for experimenters and psychologists everywhere. And Wilhelm Wundt is often referred to as the father of psychology for doing this. The first one we're going to be going over is Emma Eckstein, and this was a woman in the late 1800s who was dealing with a variety of different symptoms that today would probably be treated by either therapy or an OBGYN, but obviously the male psychologists in her time were like, we need to open this woman up and see what's going on, Her symptoms were heavy and irregular periods, difficulty in walking, and some sexual problems. So obviously two male doctors had to come in and save the day. And the two doctors who were working on her in tandem with each other were Sigmund Freud and Wilhelm Fliess. And Freud was in Austria at the time and Fliess was in Berlin. So Fliess was coming from Berlin to Austria to help Freud out with her. And he was an ear, nose, and throat doctor who was very interested in biorhythms and bisexuality. And he thought that the human nose was super interesting and much more complex than people originally thought, and not for pheromones or anything that most people would think of, but he thought that the nose must be connected to the heart, digestion, respiration, genitourinary system, and general mental health. So he used cocaine to treat a lot of his patients. So it kind of makes sense if you're high all the time, obviously you want everyone else to be high all the time as well. And he believed heavily in nasal reflex neurosis And what this was that nasal infections can lead to different problems in the female body. So different menstrual disorders, infertility, and miscarriages. So Freud obviously thought this guy was pretty good to deal with Emma, since her problems had to do with the female anatomy. So Fliess came to Austria to help Freud out. And Freud, as most of you guys probably know, but I'll just go over, he was a physician specializing in neurology, and a lot of his tactics are heavily criticized by psychologists today, but he was very revolutionary for his time, and a lot of the theories and concepts we have today are kind of built off upon his original ideas, even though a lot of psychologists discount it and consider him like crazy for the things that he thought and the things that he did. Freud had two specific specialties at that time, neurasthenia and hysteria, which nowadays would just be called chronic fatigue and somaticization disorder. And these, he explained, of course, for very sexual reasons, came about because of masturbation, coitus interruptus, basically you get interrupted during sex, and sexual abuse in childhood. So he had his, buddy, the Dr. Fliess, come to Austria to help him out. And Fliess introduced them both to cocaine. So Freud was on coke for his own personal reasons, for whatever was going on with him. And then Emma was also on coke. And then after this happened, Fliess decided he needed to operate on Emma, since the nose is connected to all these different things in the body, according to him. And he removed one of her turbinate bones, which are the bones that are in the side of your nose here. And he removed one of them, which caused so many post-op complications for her. She was hemorrhaging and bleeding out and had a disgusting discharge constantly. And only about a month later did she start to heal, but she came close to losing her life a couple of different times. Also important to mention, side note, is most of the documents from this time got destroyed because they knew it was unethical. So most of this comes from letters between the different doctors who were dealing with her. And almost all of the letters and the research, they talk about how beautiful Emma was as a patient. So obviously, there wasn't much respect for her as a person, nor as a patient with all the different things they were doing to her. So after they were able to, deal with all these hemorrhages and she was able to start to heal afterwards, she was okay, but there isn't much work on what was going on with her afterwards. So who knows if she was truly okay or whatever, but according to everything that those doctors who committed the unethical practices say, she was fine. The next one we're discussing is Loretta Bender, and she did electroshock treatments on children that she deemed as being schizophrenic, and she carried this experiment out for quite a long time, from 1942 to 1955, and this was for children anywhere from 3 to 12 years old, and it is estimated between 100 to 500 children had been subjected to this. And this was in New York City at the Bellevue Hospital, which has since been closed down and repurposed to be a homeless shelter. And it was shut down not just because of this, but because it had a lot of other ethical violations within itself. So it was a pretty problematic hospital, which she also moved on to have these experiments at a hospital in Queens. So she brought her ethical violations to numerous destinations. For the experiment itself, she would administer electroshock onto children every single day for 20 days, and it would vary in voltages because she would shock them, see the reaction, see the behavior afterwards, and then adjust the dosage to either be higher or lower. And her way of measuring was having them draw pictures of themselves. So she'd have them do a self-portrait at the beginning of the experiment and then again at the end and compare the two to see if there are any differences. And she said that the majority of her patients improved significantly, but there is no evidence besides what she claims to support this. Most of these children who were subjected to literal torture for quite a long time would be diagnosed with other things in today's psychological world than schizophrenia. For example, there was one patient who came from an abusive home. He would be terrified of his father when he would be drunk, and he was skipping school and things like that, obviously a product of his own home life since he had unstable parents, and she diagnosed him with primary behavior disorder, conduct disturbance. So obviously he needed to have electroshock. And later on, he became a mass murderer. Who knows if it was because of the electroshock in his childhood or if it was because of his home life or whatever, but I'm sure all of these factors did not help with this guy's psychological well-being. Besides him, most of these people who were diagnosed with autistic schizophrenia would now be diagnosed with either ADHD, autism, or bipolar, and ADHD and autism are extremely common in children. So, a lot of these kids had something that was very simple and very normal, but she deemed them as being schizophrenic. This next one is pretty well known. It is the Milgram Experiment, which was carried out by Stanley Milgram in 1961 at Yale. And he wanted to see if people would just blindly follow authority or if they would put their personal conscience and morals above whatever the person in power said. Milgram's main source of inspiration came from Adolf Eichmann, who was considered to be one of the ringleaders and main operators for the attempted extermination of Jews during the Holocaust. And he looked at the different accounts of those who were being held at the Nuremberg trials for their acts of genocide during the Holocaust and how they would say that they were just obeying their orders. So he took inspiration from them and created his research question, which was, could it be that Eichmann and his millions accomplices in the Holocaust were just following orders? Could we call them all accomplices? So already we're off to a pretty rocky start if you're getting your inspiration from actual Nazis. Obviously, there's something kind of iffy going on. So at that time, it was pretty close to the Holocaust, so obviously people were still trying to process and figure it out. But he decided that this made him want to see if, maybe Nazis were just awful, terrible people at their core, or if they were just following orders and it's something that everybody could potentially be if they were exposed to certain conditions. Milgram put out ads in newspapers and was accepting any man from the age of 20 to 50 to come in and be a participant. So the procedures of the experiment were that there were two different roles to play, either the learner or the teacher. The learner would be behind a glass in his own separate room where he'd be hooked up to electrodes, which were connected to an electroshock machine in the next room, where the teacher and the experimenter would be sitting facing the glass so they could see the learner. And the learner had to learn, obviously, a list of words that were paired up with each other, and the teacher would quiz him on that. And every single time he got one of them wrong, he would administer a shock to him, and the shocks would slowly increase voltage as the experiment went on, and as he got more and more words wrong. But the experiment was rigged, so the only actual participants were the people in the teacher role. The learners were always one of Milgram's inside people, and there were no actual electroshocks being administered, but they would act as if there were, and the experimenter would prompt the teacher to keep going and going. So the voltage ranged from 15 volts to 450, or so the teacher thinks, and every single participant reached 300 volts, and 65%, so the majority, reached 450 all the way. And if the experimenter said, no, I can't, he's in pain, I can't keep going, the experimenter would give different prompts to motivate him to continue, to make it kind of seem like he has no choice other than to cooperate. So clearly it worked for 65% of them, but for the other percentage, they got uncomfortable after 300 volts, which is already quite high. Clearly, Milgram found the answer to his research question, and it was that people who are ordered to do things by somebody in a position of authority do tend to blindly follow them and do what they say, and even if they did have some sort of reservation or personal morals that told them that they didn't want to do this, they kept doing it because the person in power told them to. So you might be wondering what part of this is unethical, just because, nobody was actually being harmed, nobody was being electroshocked, everything seems fine, but what Milgram did wrong is that he did not get actual, proper, informed consent. The participants did not know all the variables of the experiment, and they were put under duress and stress because they thought they were actually physically harming another individual. So even though they were following what the experimenter was saying, most of the participants did get extremely uncomfortable with what was going on, and they thought they were physically harming somebody else, which isn't an okay thing to make somebody think that they're doing. So clearly Milgram should have given them an informed consent form, but back in those days, it wasn't that common to do. The last one we're going to be talking about, and probably the most famous one, is the Stanford prison experiment. I know this has been coming up a lot more lately in the news and in media, just because of all the police brutality and awful things that have been happening lately. So I'll give you guys some more information about it now, but there's plenty of other sources if you want to look at them as well. So this was done in 1973 by Zimbardo at Stanford and some of his colleagues. And this whole point for doing this was because he heard about the brutality that was usually experienced by inmates in prisons all over America. And he wanted to see if this was due to somebody's disposition, so how they are naturally, versus the situation they're put in. So do prisoners act like criminals because that's just how they are, or is it because of their situation? And do guards act brutal and strict and extreme with the inmates because that's how they are inside, or it's because they're in a position of authority? The researchers built a little mini prison within the basement inside of the psychology building at Stanford, and it had cells. It had a place for the warden, who was Zimbardo, to sit and monitor everything, and a place for the guards. And it truly felt like it was a prison when you were inside of it. It even had bars on the cells and all that type of stuff. And he got his participants from 75 applicants, and 24 were chosen. So what they did were plenty of diagnostic interviews and personality tests and things like that, just to deem them acceptable, to make sure they didn't have any underlying problems, health issues, psychological issues, things like that. And they were randomly assigned to be guards versus prisoners. So the guards would work 8-hour shifts, and they would take turns, and they would be on call always. So if something went down at the prison, the guards would have to come in, and Zimbardo was the warden, where he would watch everything and make sure everything was going on. And the participants in this experiment were paid $15 a day, which amounts to about $88 in today's economy due to inflation. So it was a pretty decent salary for those who were participating. And the prisoners would be arrested at their homes with no warning. So it felt like it was pretty real, like they actually did a crime. And they would be taken to the local police station, where they would be booked and processed like a normal criminal. Obviously, like, it didn't go into any like proper legal data or whatever, but it was just to make sure that it actually felt like they were in the experiment. They took it pretty seriously. And after they were booked and processed, they would be taken to the makeshift jail, where they would then be removed of all their personal items. They would no longer be referred to by their names. They would be all given the same uniform, and they would be referred to by an inmate number. And this was to make them no longer feel like individuals and feel like they've lost their sense of self, which oftentimes happen to prisoners in actual jails. And obviously that takes a bit more time in real jails. So that's one of the reasons why Zimbardo decided to have them not go by their name, but by their inmate number, just to make the process happen a bit faster. Even on the first day, both sides had adopted their roles completely. The prisoners were tattletaling on the bad prisoners, trying to get on the guards' good side. The guards were forcing them to do a bunch of stuff. So all was going to plan on the first day. So the prisoners went to sleep. The guards all were doing their shifts, coming in and out of the prison and all that. And then in the morning, when the guards came to wake the prisoners up on the second day, they had found the doors barricaded, and inside the prisoners had removed their tags, labeling them with their prison ID numbers. They removed like their caps, everything that was supposed to make them all look the same. And the guards broke in very quickly because they got the fire extinguishers and sprayed the inmates with the chemicals within it so they could get in, and they stripped them naked and took all the beds out of the room. And then they put the ringleaders of the rebellion separately into solitary confinement so they couldn't rile up the rest of the prisoners. And the 3 least involved within the rebellion, so the good prisoners, were placed in a room where they were allowed to have beds, they were allowed to have their clothes back, they were allowed to eat because they took away food privileges from everybody. So these prisoners would eat in front of the others as a way to punish them. And they were allowed to shower and brush their teeth and have personal hygiene and those types of things, while everybody else had to watch them have these privileges because it was all revoked from the rebellion. Throughout the day, the prisoners started being more obedient towards the guards, but the guards still held them in contempt. So even though the prisoners were completely dependent on them and were starting to actually obey what they were saying, since they realized how easily they could have all their rights revoked, the guards were still harassing and being awful to them. So the prisoners became like more stressed out during the day, since obviously nothing they do is working to get the guards to be nicer to them. And one of the prisoners, who was labeled prisoner number 8612, suffered from acute emotional disturbance, disorganized thinking, uncontrollable crying, and rage. And the guards wouldn't let him out, but the psychologists behind the scenes realized they had to, because clearly the guy was having a mental breakdown within the jail, so they let him out. And throughout the experiment, they had multiple visitors, so parents came to visit. So the guards gave them some of their rights back just so they'd be in a better mood when they came in. A Catholic priest came in to visit at some point because he used to be a prison guard. So they had him speak to the prisoners, and he told them, like, you can't get out unless you get a lawyer. So it felt like it was actually a prison, even though it wasn't, because even the Catholic priest was acting like he was in on it. And a rumor was spread around that there was another escape that was going to happen. So the guards came down on them even stricter, which led to more stress and duress among the prisoners. While the Catholic priest was visiting, prisoner 819 broke down crying hysterically. So the psychologist placed him in a room by himself, said, we're going to go get you some food, we'll get a doctor, we'll take care of you, don't worry. So while they were getting that handled, the guards had the rest of the inmates chant things like, prisoner 819 is bad, it's prisoner 819's fault, we don't have our rights because of prisoner 819, prisoner 819 is a bad prisoner. And the psychologists realized that the prisoner 819 could hear them. So they quickly went into the room, and he was found hysterically crying. And they were like, okay, let's get you out of this experiment. Let's take you. And he was like, no, I'm a bad prisoner. I have to stay. And the psychologists were like, you know, what? Like, this isn't real. What's going on? So Zimbardo told him, you know, I'm not a prison warden. You're not an inmate. Your name is so-and-so. Let's leave. And the guy like immediately snapped out of it and was like, okay, let's go. So he was able to leave, and some other participants who were under extreme duress and extremely fragile were also able to leave, but the majority of them were still there and stayed. All of this sounds like it took months to get to, right? But it was only 6 days that took them to this point. It was supposed to go on for 2 weeks, but they had to call it off early because one of the PhD candidates at Stanford came in to do some interviews. Her name is Christina Maslick, and she is the only outsider who came into the prison that was like, what are you doing here? This is unethical. This is wrong. You're torturing these people. Let them out. And Zimbardo had even admitted after the fact, after the experiment was over, that he was no longer thinking like a psychologist, but he was thinking as a prison warden. So they proved their hypothesis to be true, and that even the psychologists who ran the experiment themselves, when put into that position of power, abused it. And they decided that it is your situation rather than your disposition that determines your abuse of power. If you've made it to the end of the video, thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys enjoyed. Feel free to comment down below any recommendations or requests that you want for a future video, and Hasna and I will take a look at them. She'll be posting on Friday with another exciting, interesting video, so make sure you look out for that. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next week.